All right, we are still on 1.2 and we are working with example number 3. So we are going to follow the same type of procedure that we were doing before. We're going to say everywhere that there's an A, we're going to replace it with a 5. And everywhere that there's a B, we're going to replace it with a 10. So I'm not going to use the colors for these examples. We're going to try to do them as normal as possible. If you like using colors, continue using colors here. So everywhere there's an A, we're going to replace it with a 5. And everywhere there's a B, we're going to replace it with a 10. So 6A divided by B becomes 6 times 5 divided by 10. B divided by A becomes 10 divided by 5. So take a second to think about where we plugged things in and why we did that. We replaced both of the A's. There was an A next to the 6 and an A on the bottom of the second fraction with 5s because that's what we were told to do. And we replaced the bottom B over here and the top B over here with 10 because that's what we were told to do. That's step number 1, is plugging in all of our variables that they give us. Now what we need to do is simplify. So starting with parentheses, we don't have anything to do inside parentheses, so we can move on to exponents. We don't have any exponents here. Then we're going to move on to multiplication and division. So we've got multiplication happening on the top of this fraction here, so let's do that. So 6 times 5 becomes 30. So we have 30 divided by 10 minus 10 divided by 5. So remember when we talked about PEMDAS the other day, we talked about how our fraction bar can be considered a grouping symbol, but it also represents division. So we can divide the top number by the bottom number. It looks just like a division symbol, right? So 30 divided by 10 becomes 3, and we're subtracting from that 10 divided by 5, which becomes 2. Now we're left with a one-step subtraction problem. 3 minus 2 becomes 1. So the final answer here is 1. All right, let's look at example number 4. So example number 4 also has a fraction in it. It's got x, y, and z. So we've got 3 different sections that we have to plug into, 3 different variables. So everywhere there's an x, we're now going to replace it with -3. Everywhere there's a y, we're going to replace it with 5. And everywhere there's a z, we're going to replace with -1. So let's rewrite this using that new information. We've got 2, but instead of writing x, we're going to write -3 instead. Minus 3 times y, but instead of y, we're writing 5. All divided by z, which is -1. So now we've plugged in, now we have to start doing our simplifying. So we are going to simplify using our PEMDAS. So parentheses, we don't have anything to do inside the parentheses. Then we move on to exponents. We don't have any exponents here. So then what we're going to do is our multiplication. So we do not want to do the division here because remember, fraction bars can be a grouping symbol. We need to get this top part simplified to be one number before we can do any division. So we need to do this multiplication, this subtraction, and this multiplication before we can do the division of the -1. So first is 2 times -3. That would give us -6. And then here we've got -3 times 5. So that would give me -15. And that's still all going to be divided by -1 once we can do that in our next step. We now need to subtract these. We need to combine them. So -6 minus 15, I'm going to just move my work up here. -6 minus 15 would become -21 over -1, or -21 divided by -1. Now that we have completely simplified the top, it is down to one number, and on the bottom is also one number. Now we can do our division. That's why we're allowed to do subtraction first, because we had to get this top part to be one number before we can do anything with our division. So a negative divided by a negative becomes a positive. So our final answer here is positive 21. So let's move on to example number 5. So here we have 3a squared plus 4b minus c, when a is equal to 4, b is equal to 2, and c is equal to -3. So everywhere we see an A, we're going to replace it with a 4. Everywhere we see a B, we're going to replace it with a 2. And everywhere we see a C, we're going to replace it with -3. So let's do just that. So we're going to have 3, but instead of A, we're going to replace that with 4 squared plus 4, but instead of B, it's now 2 minus C. So you notice that every number that I plugged in, I put into parentheses. So A was replaced by 4 in parentheses, B was replaced by 2 in parentheses, and C was replaced by -3, still in parentheses. So let's figure out what we have going on here. We need to start by simplifying with P for parentheses. We have a 4, a 2, and a -3. So there's nothing we can do inside each of those parentheses, so we move on to exponents. We have an exponent here, so we're going to deal with that. And again, exponents show us the number of times that something needs to be multiplied by itself. So this is telling us to do 4 times itself 2 times. So 4 times 4 becomes 16, right? You could leave that in parentheses if you want to, but 4 squared, this part right here, becomes 16. And now let's just rewrite everything else that we have here, because we didn't change any of that. Now looking at this, we have 3 times 16, 4 times 2, and then we've got this last little bit here. So let's deal with those. Those are all multiplication. So 3 times 16 here in the front gives us 48, plus 4 times 2 gives us 8. And then here we really have -1 times -3. So that's going to actually become +3. And since these are 3 additions, we can do them from left to right. We're going to do 48 plus 8. And then we're going to do plus 3. And that will give us our final answer of 59. All right, we've got one more example in your notes here today. So what we're going to do in that last one is look at 5d minus 3c plus d squared, when c is equal to 3 and d is equal to 2. So let's plug those values in. Everywhere we see a d, we're going to replace them with 2, and we actually have 2 of those here. So we're going to do 5 times 2 minus 3, but instead of c, we're plugging in 3. Plus, and instead of d squared, we're going to do 2 squared. Now we have to go through and simplify using PEMDAS. So once again, looking at our parentheses, there's nothing to do inside of them, so we're going to move on to our next step, which is exponents. So here we've got an exponent of 2 squared. So this is not going to change in our next step, so we'll just copy it down. But instead of having 2 squared at the end here, we're going to have 2 to the 2nd power. So 2 times itself for a total of 2 times. So 2 times 2 is 4. So that's what we did in our first step. We did our exponents. Now we've got some multiplication to deal with. We have 5 times 2 and -3 times 3. So let's do those. We have 5 times 2, that gives us 10. And -3 times 3, that gives us 9, or -9, subtracting 9. And then we'll carry that +4 down. We have to do subtraction from left to right. So we're going to do 10 minus 9 first. That becomes 1. And our last step is to do 1 plus 4, which would give us 5. So those are your 1.2 notes with 6 examples done out. Remember, this is a video. You can go back and watch it as many times as you need to and write down all the pieces. These should all be written down in your notes so that you can use them on your assessment.